let's talk about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and its community's deep and contested and complicated history with immigration. Indeed, the history of the Mormon tradition is intertwined with immigration and refugees in many intersecting ways, both in the 19th century and all the way to today. It's also come under more scrutiny and attention given the rise of anti-immigrant rhetoric within the Republican Party, especially in the wake of the magnification of the American right. And the Mormon connection to and support of immigration has been tested in important ways. In fact, I argue that this is one of the key focal points if you want to study Mormonism's relationship to America's religious right, is to trace the faith's perception of immigration. That's what I want to do, albeit quite briefly, in today's video. Every Wednesday, I try to connect the past to the present, and immigration is in today's headline. So let's talk about Mormonism's deep and complicated intersection with immigration over the last 200 years. It would be difficult to overstate how significant immigration was for the early Latter-day Saint tradition. By the Nauvoo era, a large percentage of those who joined the Latter-day Saint faith and eventually migrated out to Utah were born outside of the United States boundaries. By the end of the Nauvoo period, in fact, nearly 1 in every 4 people you might meet on the street in Nauvoo probably spoke with a British accent, meaning they had immigrated from Britain in their lives. And that immigration background only broadened once Mormonism settled out in the Mountain West in what came to be known as Utah, as Mormon missionary work became global and their missionary efforts were quite successful. Let me read a quote to you from a French visitor to Salt Lake City in 1855, describing the interracial, international society he found. Quote, "It is a strange spectacle and one full of interest that the English, Scotch, Canadians, Americans, Danes, Swedes, Norwegians, Germans, Swiss, Poles, Russians, Italians, French, Negroes, Hindus, and Australians. We even saw Chinese there." Close quote. So the Mormonism of the 19th century was an immigrant religion. That's why you had different communities settled according to different ethnic backgrounds or different languages. That's why Mormons tried to introduce their own new language, the Deseret Alphabet, that would make it easier for these international communities to speak to one another, an experiment that didn't quite work. Just recently, Stephen Cranny at the blog Times and Seasons crunched the census data and found that 20% of Utah's population in 1850 were born outside of the United States. And that rose to 33% by 1860. And this caused concerns. I know this might shock some of you, but America has long had this xenophobic streak of not fully trusting visitors and foreigners and immigrants, even though the categories of those immigrants and who should be feared has changed over the centuries. But Mormons were particularly denounced as a group that could not really be trusted as these immigrants coming in. There were accusations that these Mormons were hoodwinking these foreign converts, that the Mormons were doing what modern day parlance would be these sex trafficking, bringing in women for their polygamous wives. Disregard the fact that the majority of those who came over were coming over quite willingly. Here is a political cartoon claiming that these Mormon patriarchs were at the docks waiting for these immigrants to come in to attach them to the quote-unquote slave labor out in Utah, that the Mormons were bringing over the dregs of society. At one point in the 1870s and 1880s, the United States Secretary of State even proposed a complete ban on Mormon immigration, not allowing anyone to come into the nation who were Mormons, in many ways a precursor to what was later called for with the Muslim immigrant ban. So in other words, in the 19th century, Mormonism was an immigrant faith, and in many ways those roots stayed with them for quite a while. By the way, as a reminder, if you enjoy this type of content or believe it to be important, make sure you are subscribed to this channel, like and share the videos. Every Wednesday, I try to do these videos that connect the past to the present to show the relevance of history. Mondays, I do deep dives. Fridays, I pull back the curtain to talk about the work behind historical analysis. And if you want to give back to the channel to make sure we can continue going, you can even become a member that comes with a few perks for this channel. Anyways, let's get back to the history. Now, Latter-day Saint leaders stopped the gathering, which was when you converted to Mormonism, you moved to the church's headquarters in Utah. That's why they were immigrant faith. They stopped the gathering in the early 20th century, the first few decades. In fact, the completion of the Laie Temple in Hawaii signified that now you don't have to travel to Utah to be endowed in the temple, that we can build up the communities everywhere. However, even with the end of the gathering, and even with Mormonism's assimilation into American culture, those tethers, those deep cultural ties to immigration did not go away. Notably, Mormons were assimilating into American culture at a very moment when immigration was actually being seen more as a positive in American society. So Mormons could prove their patriotic bona fides by being welcoming to the immigrants coming in. They also recognized that by welcoming immigrants, making a more congenial atmosphere for bringing in foreigners, would also broaden the tent for welcoming Mormons. In other words, embracing immigrants for Americans also meant embracing Mormons. So many Mormon politicians actually supported immigration. And this has continued in other ways. I think it would be hard to overstate the significance of missions to the Latter-day Saint conception of immigration. Many Latter-day Saints in America served foreign missions during the 20th century, which put them in contact with these foreign communities. And if travel is a way to overcome bigotry and xenophobia, then these missions enable that. Though I know I will fully recognize there are some elements of the Mormon mission that sometimes reaffirm this us versus them mentality in these mission fields, and most scholars will highlight how missionary work has these imperialistic tendencies of looking down on these different communities. But those missions did force many Latter-day Saints to sympathize with foreign cultures. And even those Mormon missionaries who served in the United States were often working with immigrant communities who often came from the backgrounds that made them more receptive to listening to the Mormon gospel and maybe becoming baptized. So Latter-day Saints, through their missionary labor and through American assimilation, came to recognize immigration as a positive force. Throughout the 20th century, many of the surveys reinforce that Latter-day Saints were much more willing than Americans writ large to recognize the benefits of immigration and seeing it as a moral good. This even moderated the Latter-day Saint stance as they moved toward the Republican Party in the 1980s, 90s, and first decade of the 21st century, when evangelicals and the religious right and the Republican Party started becoming much more anti-immigrant. Mormons did not follow them, at least at first. And I want to emphasize that the religious right at first was not as anti-immigrant as they are now. Ronald Reagan, for instance, was much more moderate on immigration, seeing it as a crucial dynamic in his idea of world movement, free trade. The anti-immigrant shift in the right did not come later, and that's where the story with Mormonism becomes interesting. Since the 1990s, when the Republican Party became much more devoted to the culture wars, prioritizing these white grievances over economic free trade, as many scholars have said, moving beyond the Reagan image, immigration became a core talking point, especially as it became connected to the debates over border safety, which became a buzzword for the right starting in the 1990s. And it had always been around, but it took on added significance in the 90s, and surveys showed that it started taking higher significance or prioritization among the American right. And at first, Mormons bucked this trend, and this showed that the Mormon assimilation into the religious right was not total, and Latter-day Saints were not synonymous with evangelicals in in political matters. Immigration was often the key point that was highlighted for Latter-day Saints being much more compassionate conservatives would be the term. Eventually, many in Utah would call this the Utah way, this frame of talking about how we do not fall into the broader culture wars, especially the denigration of immigrants. And in 2010, probably the culmination of that effort, in 2010, a number of political, ecclesiastical, and civic leaders signed the Utah Compact, a measure that the Latter-day Saints were one of the major pushes behind, that called for a more humane approach to addressing the immigration crisis. Significantly, the Utah Compact defined immigration as a moral good and an important part of the American economy. Then a couple of years later, in 2012, a Pew Foundation survey found that Mormons believed that immigration was a good thing at a much higher, in some ways twice higher, than evangelicals when asked the question. And only 41% of Mormons saw immigration as a burden on the economy, a number that was much lower than evangelicals. In other words, Mormons were more likely to see immigration as a good thing and less likely to see it as a burden when compared to the religious right. And then let me give you one more point of data. In a major survey published in the 2016 book by David Campbell, Christopher Karpowitz, and J. Quinn Monson on Mormonism and American politics, they said that Mormons were twice as likely than evangelicals to see a rise in immigration as a positive development. This is also, I want to add, the 2015 era, kind of the last bastion of this Mormon uniqueness on the topic. The very next year, we get Patrick Kieran, who was a General Authority 70 at the time, is now an LDS apostle, delivering an address, Refuge from the Storm, which focused on refugees as this modern pilgrimage story of these people that we need to take care of, and that the world will be judged according to how we deal with refugees who have been trampled upon by the many wars, famines, and starvation and poverty that had been plaguing the world. But then things start changing. Because in 2016, we saw the rise of Donald Trump and the magnification of the Republican right, especially the evangelical wing. Donald Trump launched his presidential run by denouncing Mexican immigrants. He then called for an immigration ban, which in many ways, as I referenced earlier, is reminiscent of when the Secretary of State called for a Mormon immigration ban, because we cannot trust these people who are pledged to a different God, do not fit into our culture, do not assimilate, and on and on. Now, the LDS Church released a vague statement following Trump's initial call for a Muslim ban in December of 2015, a vague statement that reinforced that we need to be sympathetic to immigration, and especially we don't want infringements upon religious rights. So they did not specifically directly call out Trump, but they were calling out the principles behind Trump. But as Trump took control of the Republican Party, that opposition started to water down. Of course, once Trump won the election, the Mormon Tabernacle Choir sang at Trump's inauguration, and when Trump installed a new version of his Muslim immigration ban, the LDS Church put out another statement, but this statement was now much more watered down. It emphasized religious liberty, and it did not speak of immigration in the positive tones that previous statements had. And in the years since, as the magnification connected all these state politics to national issues like immigration, then the Utah distinct way of addressing immigration also started to dissolve. And immigration is now seen as a priority issue for the Utah State Party, decides Utah not bordering any foreign nations. So that leads us to where we are today, which is a bit of a conflicted and uncertain position, not completely clear where the faith is going to go from here. We have, on the one hand, a 2024 Pew Foundation survey that found nearly 70% of Latter-day Saints believing that openness to foreigners was crucial to national identity, which was substantially higher than white evangelicals. However, that number is lower than what similar questions would have polled at in among the Mormon congregation just a couple decades ago. And we also have evidence of extreme radicalization of anti-immigrant rhetoric within the Latter-day Saint communities, which had not been seen to such a degree, whether it be images of the Patriot Front marching in Utah on several occasions, or a PRRI survey from 2024 that found that nearly a third of Mormons believed that illegal immigrants were, quote, poisoning the blood of the nation, a very nefarious and horrible quote that's actually connected to Nazism. Now, the LDS Church released another statement in January of 2025 that, quote, reaffirms immigration principles of love, law, and family unity. But, and I'll close with this point, that while it is saying that we need to approach immigration with love, law, and family unity, it no longer emphasizes, like previous church statements did, things like immigration being a moral good or immigration being a key to economy. In other words, it's a much more watered down version of the support for immigration, which I think indicates the changing circumstances surround the Latter-day Saints, to where now we have, one of the most prominent LDS politicians, Mike Lee, denouncing BYU for being open to foreign students or having a page for their Dreamer students, and the BYU therefore having to take those pages down. So I think in general, the overall conclusion I take from this is the erosion of the unique Mormon political perspective. Whereas Mormons used to not fully become synonymous with white evangelicals in the religious right, now that's becoming less the case. Latter-day Saints are still more favorable of immigration than evangelicals, but that difference between those two groups is not nearly as wide as it used to be. And further, it shows how the LDS institution does respond to the anxiety of its members, and in many ways is still shaped by the American political context. Who knows where this is going to go from here? We'll see if that distance of Mormon and evangelical views on immigration continues to collapse, or maybe that might change going further. Historians make horrible prophets, but I think the past shapes us in many ways, and we're going to have to understand whatever future developments come within the context of what's come before. If I missed anything in this general overview, please make sure to let me know in the comments. If you found this video helpful, please like and share it with friends. Subscribe to the channel if you have not yet. And if you want to give back and support the channel, please consider becoming a member. History has never been more relevant than it is today, which is why I believe these discussions are so important, and I'm glad to have these discussions with you.